Have you ever wondered what was really poured into your cup on a long, dusty road in the aftermath of war? What if I told you that in the deep Missouri hills, men whispered about a drink that didn't just quench thirst, it swallowed lives?
Whole? The year is not spoken aloud yet, but the smell of damp timber and wood smoke lingers in the hollows. A narrow road curls through the Ozark ridges where travelers vanish without a trace. Families who set out westward never arrive. Names are scratched from letters, stories cut short, mid-dash, sentence dot. And in every tavern, when the fire burns low, one question drifts through the air like smoke. What did those brothers serve? And why did no one dare to ask twice? This is not just a story. It's a secret that was meant to die in the soil of the Ozarks. But today, we are digging it back up. The Ozarks in the aftermath of the Civil War were not the rolling, picturesque highlands romanticized in later decades, but a harsh, unsettled frontier caught between recovery and ruin. In 1867, the ridges rose like walls of shadow, their forests, dense and unbroken, swallowing sound in a silence that was more suffocating than peaceful. The air smelled of damp pine and decaying leaves, the ground often slick from sudden rains that carved gullies into wagon roads. Travelers who entered these hills rarely did so lightly. Every creak of a wagon wheel, every rustle in the underbrush carried a reminder that this land, though breathtaking, was far from safe. The war had officially ended 2 years earlier, but its scars were everywhere. Missouri had been a battleground state, divided in loyalty, and the Ozarks bore the weight of that division. Burned-out farmhouses dotted the valleys. Entire families had fled, leaving their land to the wilderness. Men who once wore uniforms, Union blue or Confederate gray, now roamed the hills with no master but hunger. The word bushwhacker became more than a label. It was a living terror, describing men who ambushed travelers for their meager possessions, men hardened by years of killing who had no desire to return to the plow. It was into this fragile, almost lawless environment that the cold case of the brothers began to form. Before their tavern was built, the area around their land was already whispered about. The road itself, a twisting, rutted trail threading through the ridges, had a reputation for swallowing people. Merchants spoke of delays, of companions who vanished between one bend and the next. Letters sent from St. Louis to Springfield went undelivered, lost not to the incompetence of postal riders, but to something darker, something that fed on the isolation of the Ozarks. The brothers did not invent that fear, but they stepped into it, shaping it, turning it to their advantage. Life. In 1867, Missouri was marked by uncertainty. Few families trusted their neighbors, and the constant turnover of settlers moving west meant strangers passed through daily. For the weary traveler, a tavern represented safety, warmth, a bed, a meal, and the reassurance of human contact after days on unforgiving trails. The brothers understood this deeply. They cultivated an image of modest hospitality. Their establishment was not grand, a crude log structure with a chimney that coughed smoke into the treetops, a lean-to stable, a wooden sign that swayed in the wind. Yet it drew people in, because in the Ozarks, even the roughest tavern was better than the uncertainty of another night in the open. What made their presence so unsettling was not the tavern itself, but the atmosphere it created. Survivors who passed through described the interior as oppressively quiet. Taverns were supposed to hum with life, clinking cups, laughter, arguments, the shuffle of boots on a dirt floor. But here, conversation seemed strangled. The brothers kept to themselves, speaking only when necessary, their eyes flicking between guests as if measuring them. The food was passable, the drink strong, but there was something in the air that left visitors uneasy, like stepping into a church desecrated for purposes it was never meant to serve. The larger context of 1867 adds another layer to this unease. Reconstruction politics gripped Missouri. Lawmen were underpaid, poorly equipped, and often too entangled in local disputes to act with impartiality. In rural regions like the Ozarks, a sheriff might cover miles of territory, his authority extending only as far as the loyalty of the men who supported him. Justice was selective, and the disappearance of a few travelers, especially outsiders, with no kin nearby, was not enough to stir an official investigation. This vacuum allowed the brothers to thrive. Each missing person became another ghost swallowed by the hills, their absence chalked up to bandits, wild animals, or simply bad luck. But the pattern did not go unnoticed. Local farmers whispered of strange sights, wagons left standing by the roadside, horses wandering without riders, shallow mounds of earth that appeared after heavy rains. Some swore they heard cries in the night, carried down the hollows by the wind, though when they approached the tavern at dawn, the brothers greeted them with calm, unblinking faces. The contradictions gnawed at the community. Were these men simply unlucky innkeepers falsely accused by circumstance? Or were they architects of something grim, using the isolation of the Ozarks as their cloak? The year 1867 sharpened these questions because of the transient nature of the population. The great westward migration was in full swing, families packed, wagons with all they owned, chasing promises of fertile land in Kansas, Oklahoma, or beyond. To them, Missouri was a corridor, a place to be crossed rather than settled. Few of these travelers knew the land well, and fewer still had allies to vouch for them if they disappeared. The Brothers' Tavern sat like a snare along this migration, path ready to catch the desperate and the weary. Every traveler who stopped there carried not just possessions, but trust. Trust that they would wake the next morning to continue their journey. That trust, in too many cases, proved fatal. Though details remain murky, the essence of the cold case rests on one fact: people vanished, and the tavern was often their last known stop. The stories differ. Some say poison was slipped into drinks, others claim knives in the dark. Still others whisper of rituals carried out under moonlight. The bodies fed to the earth itself. None of these tales could be verified, but all shared the same chilling core. The brothers served more than water, and what they offered was never meant to sustain life. The geography of the Ozarks magnified the terror. The land was a labyrinth of valleys and ridges, caves and sinkholes, streams that disappeared underground for miles before resurfacing. A body could vanish here as easily as a candle flame in the wind. Those who searched often returned empty-handed, their resolve broken by the sheer vastness of the terrain. The brothers knew this, and if indeed they were guilty, they wielded the land itself as their accomplice. When outsiders finally pressed for answers, merchants demanding to know why their associates had not arrived, families writing letters begging for news, the official responses were vague. The road is dangerous. Accidents happen. The wilderness claims many. Each explanation was plausible, but each avoided the truth locals dared not speak aloud. To accuse the brothers directly was to risk drawing their attention, and in a region where law had no teeth, such an accusation might be a death sentence in itself. Thus the legend began to take root, fed by fear, silence, and rumor. By the time the case was whispered beyond the Ozarks, it had already hardened into myth. Travelers who passed through were told not to linger near that stretch of road, not to drink from cups offered too freely, not to trust smiles that came without warmth. Yet still the tavern stood, its chimney puffing smoke, its doors opening and closing, swallowing one guest after another. In 1867 Missouri, the line between survival and predation was thin. Hunger, desperation, and lawlessness bred men who would do anything to secure their place in a collapsing world. The brothers embodied this tension. Whether they were murderers, opportunists, or something darker, they became symbols of a time when the Ozarks themselves seemed to conspire against the living. Their tavern was no longer merely a waypoint on the road. It was a shadow, a wound in the land, a reminder that in those years, the price of a drink might well be your life. The brothers of the Missouri Ozarks were not men who drew attention to themselves at first glance. They were lean, quiet, and ordinary in appearance, their faces hardened not by age, but by the kind of work that carved lines into a man early. Their clothes were simple, rough-spun, and always carried the dust of the road or the soot of a hearth fire. To a traveler, they might have seemed like just another pair of frontier men trying to make a living after the ruin of the war. Yet it was precisely this ordinariness that made them so dangerous. They blended seamlessly into the background of the Ozarks, men who appeared to be nothing more than hosts offering respite from the wilderness, while beneath that mask lurked intentions no one dared to name aloud. Their tavern was their stage, and like skilled actors, the brothers performed a version of hospitality that concealed something colder. One brother was said to be the talker, though even his words were scarce and weighted. He spoke with a drawl, his sentences clipped as though each one cost him effort. The other was quieter still, a man of gestures, his communication more often. A nod, a motion of his hand, or the simple placement of a cup on the table. Together, they gave travelers the sense of being watched without being spoken to, measured without being weighed openly. For some, that silence was unnerving. For others, exhausted from the road, it was simply overlooked. What set them apart from the many other men running roadside stops was not their appearance, but the reputation that clung to them. Locals whispered that they had arrived in the area, suddenly with no kin, no past that anyone could trace. In a region where most families had known each other for generations, their anonymity was unsettling. They claimed a piece of land off a main wagon trail, and within a season had constructed the tavern, a building of rough-hewn logs with a central room for eating and drinking, a back chamber for lodging, and a stable for weary horses. Everything about it seemed practical, functional, even welcoming on the surface. But to those who lingered, there was something uncanny about how quickly the place took root, as though the brothers had been waiting for it all along. The tavern drew people, and with necessity, travelers could not be choosers on the long, punishing road, and a roof over one's head was better than the cold forest floor. But those who left spoke of the atmosphere inside. Some described the air as heavy, as though smoke from the hearth never fully cleared. Others recalled the silence, broken only by the occasional scrape of wood against wood, or the low murmur of voices that never carried far. The brothers did not encourage conversation. They asked few questions, and when they did, they seemed to watch the answers more closely than the faces speaking them. One merchant wrote in his journal that he felt as if the brothers were counting him, though he could not explain what that meant. Their reputation among locals was more complicated. Farmers and woodcutters in the region admitted that the brothers were hard men to read. They paid for supplies promptly, rarely engaged in disputes, and did not waste words. Yet something about them stirred discomfort. They never attended church, never joined gatherings, and never spoke of their past. Their land, though modest in size, always seemed to yield more than it should. Livestock fed well, crops grew quickly, though no one ever saw the brothers working the fields as often as was necessary. Some muttered that the land itself favored them, others that their prosperity was purchased at a cost too dark to speak of aloud. Travelers who disappeared added weight to those suspicions. At first, no one drew direct connections. The Ozarks were treacherous, and vanishings were common. But when the missing had one common link, the tavern, the rumors sharpened. Still, the brothers never wavered in their behavior. They remained outwardly calm, denying everything without ever showing anger or fear. If asked about a missing traveler, they would shrug, suggest the road was dangerous, and continue on with their work. Their composure unnerved those who pressed the matter. It was not the defensive rage of guilty men, but the steady, cold indifference of men for whom death was simply another transaction. The brothers also understood the importance of appearances. They were never seen drunk, never involved in fights, never caught in theft. In a time when tavern keepers often had reputations as rough men themselves, these brothers cultivated a different image, sober, steady, respectable on the surface. But this very restraint, paired with their silence, made them seem all the more sinister. Neighbors noted that their eyes rarely softened, their expressions seldom changed. They were present, but not quite human in the way they engaged with others, as if something in them had been emptied out long ago and replaced with calculation. There were stories, too, of strange behavior after dark. Travelers who stayed overnight claimed to hear movement in the yard at odd hours, footsteps pacing back and forth, or the creak of a cart when no horses had been hitched. Some swore they heard the sound of shovels biting into earth, the dull thud of dirt falling back into a hole. When asked, the brothers explained it away as routine chores, tending livestock or repairing fences. Yet those who heard it insisted the sounds carried a rhythm that suggested something less innocent. Perhaps the most chilling element of their reputation was the way animals reacted to them. Horses tied outside the tavern often grew restless, stamping and snorting as though sensing danger. Dogs brought by travelers refused to settle, whining or growling low in their throats when the brothers passed. In a land where animals were seen as sharper judges of character than men, these reactions added fuel to the suspicions. Locals began to avoid the tavern when possible, choosing the hardship of the open road over the unease of a night under the brothers' roof. And yet, for every traveler who whispered warnings, there were others who insisted the brothers had done them no harm. Some claimed the tavern was simply a place like any other, and that the dark stories were born of paranoia and bad luck. It was this contradiction that made the brothers so difficult to confront. Their reputation balanced between suspicion and plausibility, never tipping fully into certainty. Without undeniable proof, they remained untouchable, their silence and composure shielding them from consequence. This ambiguity became part of their legend. They were not monsters in appearance, nor wild-eyed killers foaming at the mouth. They were ordinary, unremarkable men who built their lives around a modest tavern and worked it with discipline. But beneath that surface they carried an aura of calculation, of restraint so tight it seemed unnatural. Their reputation was not forged by one act but by the accumulation of unease, the way every detail of their lives hinted at something unspoken. In the end, it was not what they did in plain sight that haunted travelers, but what everyone suspected happened when the doors closed, when the lamps were blown out, and when the road outside grew silent but for the echo of a shovel cutting earth. The disappearances began quietly, almost invisibly, as if the Ozark Hills themselves had swallowed the travelers whole. In 1867, no one kept precise records of who entered and who left these rugged valleys, and in that silence, the missing became little more than whispers. The first case that drew attention was a merchant, a man from St. Louis who had set out toward Springfield with a wagon heavy with goods. He was last seen on the road that wound past the brothers' tavern. His horse was found weeks later, grazing loose in a hollow, but the man was never seen again. At first, his fate was attributed to bushwhackers or the hazards of the road, but the details unsettled those who heard them. The horse's saddle was intact. The wagon still bore traces of the man's supplies. Nothing had been looted, and yet he had vanished as though the ground opened beneath him. Soon after, a family traveling westward disappeared in much the same way. Their wagon was discovered abandoned, the wheels half sunk in mud, the canvas torn slightly but otherwise undisturbed. Inside were children's clothes, pots, and bedding, evidence that they had not intended to leave it behind. Neighbors who searched the surrounding woods reported no bodies, no footprints, only the faint smell of smoke drifting from the brothers' tavern chimney the morning after they were last seen. No one dared accuse openly, but in every farmhouse conversation, the link was made. Travelers passing through began to trade stories. A man riding alone claimed he had been offered a drink that tasted off, metallic, bitter, though he could not name why. He spat it out and left, riding through the night without stopping. When he told the story later, he confessed that the look in the brother's eyes as he set down his untouched cup haunted him, as though he had interrupted something he was never meant to see. Others who stayed at the tavern spoke of the brothers' habit of watching too closely as guests ate or drank, their expressions unreadable, their silence heavy enough to make a man's skin crawl. Patterns emerged slowly, stitched together from rumor and observation. Those who vanished shared common details. They were often strangers, passing through alone or in small groups, with few connections in the area. They carried possessions worth taking, money, tools, horses, wagons, but in many cases, what was left behind suggested theft was not the sole motive. This was what made the mystery more chilling. Robbers in the Ozarks left evidence of their crime. The brothers, if guilty, left nothing but silence and absence. Some locals began to see strange activity near the tavern at night. A farmer claimed He saw lantern light moving across the fields behind the building, long after the tavern had closed. Small figures bent low to the ground as though digging. He stayed quiet, fearing that to speak would draw unwanted attention. Another man swore he had heard muffled cries carried on the wind while he camped along the road. In the morning, he rode past the tavern and saw the brothers standing outside, calm, with no trace of what he thought he had heard. When he asked if they had noticed anything in the night, they only shook their heads and said the woods carried strange sounds in these hills. The fear grew not from confirmed evidence, but from the way each piece of the puzzle seemed to fit with the next. When questioned, the brothers never faltered. They suggested travelers had been taken by bandits, had run off, or had fallen prey to the wild terrain. Their voices were steady, their faces unreadable, but their explanations carried no warmth, only indifference. That indifference chilled those who listened. Even if they were innocent, the lack of concern, the refusal to show any humanity toward the missing, suggested something was deeply wrong. By autumn of 1867, the cold case had hardened into rumor, so widespread that few dared pass the tavern unless forced. Merchants chose longer, rougher routes to avoid the brothers' land. Families hurried by without stopping, their wagons creaking into the night. Yet still, disappearances continued. A young couple traveling toward Arkansas vanished after telling a farmer they would stop at the tavern for the night. A preacher, passing through on horseback, was never seen again, though his Bible was found weeks later, waterlogged near a creek downstream. Each disappearance pressed the weight of suspicion heavier on the brothers, and yet no sheriff raised a hand against them. The reasons for official silence were many. Lawmen in the Ozarks were stretched thin, their authority fragile in the face of communities scarred by war. To accuse the brothers would require proof, and proof was nearly impossible in a land where the wilderness swallowed evidence whole. But there was also fear. To accuse them was to risk their retaliation, and no one was eager to become the next name lost to the woods. The brothers' cold composure seemed to dare anyone to confront them, their very silence a weapon sharper than any blade. For those who believed the worst, the mystery lay not only in the disappearances but in the method. Why did the brothers leave wagons intact, horses alive, belongings scattered but untouched? Why did they conceal the bodies so thoroughly that even the most determined searches found nothing? Some argued that the motive was ritual, that the missing were not merely killed for gain but for reasons darker, reasons bound to the land itself. Others claimed it was a form of control, that by erasing the evidence they instilled greater terror than any open robbery could. The truth, whatever it was, remained out of reach. What is known is that the pattern of vanishings altered the very rhythm of the region. Taverns were meant to be places of refuge, of human company, against the loneliness of the frontier. But the Brothers' Tavern became a place of dread, a reminder that safety was an illusion, that those who trusted too easily might never be seen again. To this day, accounts from the time carry a strange mix of fear and resignation. People knew what they suspected, but the silence of the hills held it in place, as though the land itself conspired with the brothers to keep the truth hidden. And so the disappearances were never solved. They became a cold case not because there was no fire behind them, but because the flames were smothered by fear, by silence, by the vastness of the Ozarks. Each traveler who vanished added another ghost to the legend, another shadow to the tavern, until it was no longer simply a place to rest, but a symbol of the dangers lurking in the heart of a land that could not be tamed. The whispers began in taverns and campfires long before anyone dared put them into writing. Travelers who survived the Brothers' Inn spoke of something strange about the drink they were offered. At first glance, it seemed like ordinary water, dipped from a wooden bucket and poured into tin cups. Yet those who tasted it swore there was a bitterness beneath the surface, a metallic tang that clung to the tongue. Some dismissed it as the flavor of the well, perhaps tainted by minerals leaching through the Ozark limestone, but others believed it was deliberate, that the brothers poured more into the water than nature ever could. The rumors spread in fragments, shared by men who had no reason to lie. One drover claimed he took only a sip before his vision blurred, his hands trembling as though fever had struck him. He staggered from the tavern and rode through the night, swearing he heard voices calling. Behind him in the dark, a peddler told of a strange heaviness in his limbs after finishing a cup, so severe that he barely made it to the door before collapsing against his wagon. When he awoke, hours had passed, and the brothers stood nearby, staring silently as though waiting to see whether he would rise. They offered no explanation, only returned to their work as though nothing had happened. These stories carried weight in the Ozarks, where people trusted their senses more than they trusted law or scripture. If the water tasted wrong, if it made strong men collapse, then something unnatural was at work. Yet no one could prove it. The brothers never drank from their own cups when travelers visited. They poured for others, but their own thirst was always quenched from a separate vessel, one they kept behind the counter. Those who noticed this detail rarely spoke of it aloud, for fear of what it might mean. The rumors took on a darker shape in local gatherings. In hushed tones, men and women suggested that the brothers did not use poison merely to rob their guests. If robbery were the motive, why leave wagons untouched? Why let valuables rot in the mud? No, the water, they said, was a key to something else, something hidden. One old farmer, after too many drinks of his own, claimed the brothers belonged to a secret society, a group that fed not on wealth, but on the lives of others. He whispered of rituals carried out in the forests, where drugged travelers were led like lambs to slaughter. Whether he truly believed this or merely sought to frighten his listeners, the idea rooted itself deeply in the minds of those who heard. The tavern itself became part of the story. Guests spoke of meals that tasted fine but left them sluggish, of ale that dulled the senses faster than it should. A widow traveling with her son wrote in her diary that after eating supper there, she felt as though a fog had settled over her thoughts. Her son urged her to leave before nightfall, and though exhausted, they pressed on down the road. Weeks later, she heard of another family who had stayed the night in the same rooms and never emerged. Her entry ended with the line, "We chose the road, and so we lived." The brothers, for their part, never acknowledged the whispers. If confronted, they shrugged, claimed the well water was strong with iron, or that travelers were weary and mistook fatigue for illness. Their composure only deepened the suspicion. For the more they denied, the more people felt that something was being hidden behind those blank expressions. And when another traveler failed to arrive at his destination, the stories of bitter water returned to the surface like a body rising in the current. The rumors also carried an unspoken warning. Those who repeated them too loudly sometimes found themselves shunned or silenced. A man in a nearby town claimed publicly that the brothers were poisoning guests. Days later, he was discovered beaten and left for dead along a roadside. He survived. But when asked again about his accusations, he said only that he had been mistaken, that the brothers were good men. Few believed his change of heart was voluntary. The message was clear. Some stories were safer whispered than shouted. Over time, the phrase "more than water" entered the local vocabulary. It was spoken with a shiver, half as a joke, half as a curse. A man who drank too much and passed out in a ditch was said to have had more than water. A traveler who fell mysteriously ill on the road was whispered to have stopped at the wrong tavern. The expression carried weight because it spoke to a fear larger than the brothers themselves, the fear that in a land already dangerous there were men willing to twist the simple acts of hospitality into traps. What was truly in the water remained a mystery. Some insisted it was laudanum or another sedative, easy enough to obtain after the war when medicines were traded in bulk across the frontier. Others claimed it was hemlock, foxglove, or some poisonous root gathered from the hills. A few even argued it was not poison at all, but witchcraft, something brewed with intent, not merely to kill, but to bind, to capture a soul before releasing it. Each explanation, though different, circled the same conclusion. The brothers used the act of drinking, an act of trust, of communion, to undo their victims. The chilling part of the rumor was not only what was in the cup, but what came after. Those who survived the bitter taste spoke of the way the brothers looked at them, as though disappointed the drink had not finished its work. One man swore he saw the quiet brother tighten his grip on a knife when he pushed away his half-empty cup. Another claimed that as he stumbled out the door, the talkative brother followed him with eyes cold as river stones, eyes that seemed to measure how much longer he would live. In the end, the stories of the water became inseparable from the disappearances themselves. People no longer asked simply who had vanished, but whether they had stopped to drink at the tavern first. Mothers warned their sons not to accept cups from strangers, repeating the tale of the bitter taste until it became part of the folklore of the region. And travelers, even those who laughed at such superstition, found themselves uneasy when a cup of water was pressed into their hands by men whose smiles never reached their eyes. The brothers' tavern endured, its chimney smoke curling into the sky as though nothing were amiss, but its reputation darkened with every retelling. The more people vanished, the more the phrase "more than water" spread, carrying with it the suggestion that beneath the simple act of refreshment lay something sinister, something meant to still the body and silence the voice. And though no one ever proved what was in those cups, the fear of them remained, echoing long after the tavern itself was gone, a warning carried forward in whispers and silence. The deeper one ventures into the folds of the Missouri Ozarks in 1867, the more the land itself seems to conspire against the notion of peace. Travelers often remark that the forests seemed to listen, that the rocks themselves felt ancient, enough to bear grudges, and that the winding trails were as much a maze of memory as they were of geography. For those unfamiliar with the region, the sense of unease was constant, a whisper that one did not belong, that the earth had seen too much blood and betrayal to allow strangers to pass without consequence. And it was within this setting, among the hills, caves, and twisting riverbeds, that the brothers' names became a curse spoken in low tones, a warning meant to chill the hearts of those foolish enough to ignore it. To understand why their story carried such weight, one must first recall what the Missouri Ozarks represented at the time. The Civil War had left scars not only upon men but upon entire communities. The region had been fractured by guerrilla warfare, shifting loyalties, and a brutal form of neighbor-against-neighbor violence that few outsiders could truly comprehend. Distrust was the currency of survival, and violence was a language more fluent than prayer. Amid this unstable landscape, the disappearance of travelers was not always shocking. Yet when patterns emerged, when stories of two men lurking along lonely stretches of road took root, the whispers hardened into something else, a legend that drew its strength from fear. The brothers, whose given names rarely passed lips without unease, were remembered less as men than as specters. They were said to have built a small dwelling near an old trading route, a cabin no larger than the size of a freight wagon, with smoke that curled upward in thin, hungry lines. Some said the brothers had fought in the war, that the violence had eaten away at them until cruelty became their only solace. Others claimed they were deserters who turned their rifles not on soldiers but on innocents, finding in robbery and bloodshed a new battlefield where no law could follow. Still others whispered of something older, darker, a family curse that drove them to acts most would not dare to imagine. What united all these versions was the certainty that travelers vanished in their presence, that men, women, and sometimes children set out on roads that twisted past their territory and were never seen again. Accounts of their method were contradictory but always chilling. Some claimed the brothers would offer water to weary travelers, a kindness that concealed the bitter edge of deceit. The water, drawn from a well that many believed was tainted, had an aftertaste that some swore was metallic, as if blood had seeped into the earth itself. After drinking, those travelers would find themselves weakened, their bodies sluggish, their judgment clouded. What happened next varied depending on the teller. Some said the victims were robbed and left for dead. Others said they were dragged into the woods where shallow graves were hastily carved into the soil. And still others spoke of darker rituals, that the land demanded blood, and the brothers, in their twisted way, gave it willingly. The chilling consistency of these tales was that travelers disappeared without trace. Wagons were found abandoned, horses left wandering, belongings scattered. As though dropped in haste, families who went searching for their loved ones sometimes returned empty-handed, their faces gray with horror, refusing to speak of what they had glimpsed near the brothers' cabin. In some cases, there were bones, gnawed, weathered, and buried in shallow earth, but never enough to account for the number of souls said to have vanished. The land seemed to swallow evidence as readily as it swallowed light, leaving only rumor behind. Locals, hardened by years of violence, might have confronted the brothers directly, but fear worked its will as effectively as a loaded rifle. Stories spread of men who sought justice but failed to return, of neighbors who dared to accuse the brothers only to find their barns burned or their livestock slaughtered. One woman, whose husband disappeared after accepting an offer of water along the road, was said to have wandered into town with her hands shaking and her eyes wide, whispering that she had heard voices in the trees calling her husband's name in the dead of night. She would not speak of the brothers openly, but her silence was more damning than any accusation. What made the case even more sinister was the sense that the brothers themselves thrived on the whispers. They were rarely seen in daylight, but when they appeared, it was with a confidence that bordered on menace. One traveler described encountering them on a narrow path, two men standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces unreadable, their eyes reflecting no hint of warmth. He turned back before they spoke, but the memory of their stillness haunted him for years. Others said the brothers laughed at the fear they caused, that they enjoyed the way conversations fell silent when they entered a room, as if terror itself was a cloak they wore proudly. By the time local authorities were forced to acknowledge the rumors, the story had already grown into something monstrous. There was no single crime scene to investigate, no body to exhume that could serve as undeniable proof. Instead, there were countless fragments, shreds of clothing found along a trail, bloodstains on stone, testimonies whispered by survivors who had narrowly escaped. Together, these fragments painted a picture too horrifying to ignore. The brothers were not simply thieves or murderers. They were predators who had turned an entire stretch of road into their hunting ground. And so the mystery deepened. How many had vanished because of them? Why had no one stopped them sooner? And what became of the brothers themselves? Some said they were hunted down by vigilantes who buried their remains in unmarked graves so no one would ever know where they lay. Others claimed they escaped into the wilderness, blending into the dark folds of the Ozarks, like wraiths who could never be caught. The most chilling version suggested they never left at all, that their spirits lingered, restless and unsated, waiting for new travelers to stumble into their territory. Each version carried weight, for in the Ozarks, truth was never so much a matter of evidence as it was of belief, and belief had the power to shape fear into fact. Thus, the brothers. Legend became more than a story of murder. It became a parable of the dangers of isolation, of the thin line between survival and savagery in a land already broken by war. The Ozarks in 1867 were a place where justice often arrived too late, if at all, and where silence was a form of protection. And in that silence, the brothers thrived, their tale spreading like smoke through the trees, staining the region with a legacy of dread that would haunt generations to come. The Missouri Ozarks of 1867 carried an atmosphere that seemed perpetually draped in shadow. For those who had lived through the war years, the land was more than geography. It was memory, scarred and brooding. The hills held secrets in their folds, the caves swallowed voices, and the rivers carried whispers downstream. Travelers who dared to cut through this wilderness spoke of a strange heaviness in the air, a feeling that eyes watched them from the tree line. To some, this was simply the way of untamed country. To others, it was the lingering presence of violence not yet at rest. And it was within this atmosphere that the chilling legend of the brothers began to settle into permanence, shifting from rumor into myth. As word of their deeds spread, fear became a law of its own. Families passing through the Ozarks would huddle closer at night, reluctant to camp near water sources that might have once been offered by the brothers' hands. Teamsters, driving freight wagons, would choose longer, more treacherous routes just to avoid the area where the brothers were said to haunt the roads. Even those who lived within the region treated the land differently. They did not linger after sundown. They locked doors not only against thieves but against something more primal, something they could not quite name. Fear carved invisible borders. through the hills, and anyone who crossed them did so at their own peril. Part of what made the brothers' story so enduring was its ambiguity. Unlike ordinary crimes, which could be investigated and perhaps solved, their acts seemed to dissolve into the air. For every witness who swore they saw the brothers lure a traveler from his horse, there were others who insisted the men were phantoms, not flesh and blood at all. The absence of bodies left questions no authority could easily answer. Were the brothers mere opportunists, taking advantage of the chaos left by war to rob and kill? Or had they become something darker, symbols of the Ozarks' violence, manifestations of the cruelty bred in isolation? These questions had no clear answer, and in their absence, fear filled the void. That uncertainty gave rise to tales too chilling to ignore. There were whispers that the brothers never worked alone, that others in nearby settlements quietly aided them, hiding stolen goods, covering their tracks, or even benefiting from their crimes. In such a fractured society, where justice was often no more than the vengeance of armed neighbors, it was not impossible to believe. If true, the brothers were not just two killers, but the face of a broader corruption that reached deeper into the fabric of the region. Every unexplained disappearance, every abandoned wagon, every haunting silence along the trails fed into the legend, until it was difficult to tell where fact ended and fear began. The chilling effect of their deeds extended far beyond the immediate victims. Stories of the missing bled into the consciousness of surrounding towns, becoming part of the local identity. A stranger arriving in a village might find himself greeted with wary eyes, for the locals knew that outsiders were often the ones who vanished. Parents warned their children not to stray far from home, weaving the brothers' name into lullabies that blurred the line between caution and curse. The roads themselves became haunted places, their emptiness a reminder of those who had once passed but never arrived. It was as though the land bore a stain that no amount of time could wash away. The brothers' disappearance only deepened the dread. Had they been killed quietly, their bodies hidden so that no one could ever prove their guilt? Or had they melted into the wilderness, alive and waiting, their silence more terrifying than any confession? Each possibility carried its own horror. If they were dead, their spirits might linger, restless and unsatisfied, haunting the very trails they once prowled. If they lived, then every rustle in the underbrush, every sound of footsteps behind a traveler on a lonely road, might be them returning. The uncertainty made the legend immortal, for it left no closure, no resolution that could dull the fear. Some claimed that the land itself conspired with the brothers. Hunters spoke of finding shallow pits in the earth, filled not with deer bones, but with fragments of human remains. Farmers claimed that certain wells ran foul, their water tainted by a bitterness that no bucket could draw clean. More than one preacher declared the ground cursed, that the violence of the Civil War had invited demons into the Ozarks, and that the brothers were merely vessels for something older and darker than themselves. Whether born of superstition or of desperate attempts to explain the unexplainable, these beliefs only magnified the terror. The brothers ceased to be mere men in the public mind. They became symbols of the land's unyielding cruelty. Travelers who survived encounters with them rarely spoke openly, but when pressed, their stories carried a bone-deep dread. One man described being offered water at the roadside. He accepted, but before drinking, he noticed a strange sheen on the surface, as if oil floated there. Something in him recoiled, and he feigned thirst quenched, handing the cup back. The brothers, he claimed, smiled in a way that made his blood run cold, as though they already knew he had seen through them. Another woman recounted fleeing after, hearing voices calling her name in the night, only to find no one nearby. Whether these experiences were real or the product of fear is almost impossible to say, but they lingered in the minds of those who heard them, shaping the legend further. The chilling effect on the region was not only psychological but economic. Trade routes through the Ozarks suffered as merchants avoided the area, fearing robbery or worse. Inns and way stations that had once thrived on passing travelers found themselves deserted. Even lawmen hesitated to intervene, for without solid proof, pursuing the brothers meant stepping into shadows where law had no authority, and so silence ruled. silence born not of peace, but of dread. That silence allowed the legend to grow, unchecked, filling the gaps with rumor and imagination until it was larger, more menacing, than any pair of men could truly be. In time, the story of the brothers ceased to belong solely to the Missouri Ozarks. It spread outward, carried by those who escaped or who merely heard the tale secondhand. Travelers spoke of it in taverns hundreds of miles away, their voices dropping to whispers as if the brothers might hear across the distance. Writers scribbled notes about the cursed roads of the Ozarks, folding the legend into a broader narrative of America's haunted frontiers. The further the story traveled, the less it resembled ordinary crime and the more it resembled myth. And like all myths born of violence and fear, it endured precisely because it was never fully understood.